You're not afraid of the dark, are you? You're going to die.
Hello? Did you hear that? Did you hear that? That was like a whisper. Hello? Getting footsteps. I kept hearing kind of like a breathing thing. Hello? Is anybody there?
Now, I always find it really interesting when a newspaper anywhere in the world suddenly brings me a story from a property that I've already visited. In this case, it's a house at number 39 de Grey Street in Hull. A lot of people today claiming it to be Britain's most haunted house. They've even asked the police to investigate evil forces lurking in this 7-bedroom property after children's shadows had been seen, knives moving, arms, dark shapes, and people screaming. The neighbours hate the property. They have phoned the police on several occasions claiming there was someone in the house, yet when the police arrived, they're freaked out by it, but they find the property completely empty. It's been free of inhabitation for about 7 and a bit years now. Nobody lived there because of the sheer weight of paranormal activity. Now, it was six and a half years ago I was first introduced to this place. The longest tenant in recent years only managing to last 4 days before being chased out. Now, the reason I went down to see it was some students from Durham University were not allowed into the property. Now, this was about 7 years ago. So what they did, they got some ladders and they placed a recording device on a hot summer's day at the window above the garage, the window upstairs above the living room, and on the living room itself. 3 recording devices. The downstairs living room didn't have anything other than traffic and people passing by. This is what they caught on the window above the garage. Now, the one directly above their living space, this is where you hear the voices of children screaming. Have a listen to this. Now, the locals around Hull have dubbed this building the Hostel. They have reported seeing children's shadows coming out of the fireplace, steak knives being moved overnight to the degree that one of them moved into the living room and plunged itself into a table, and there was nobody in the house. The person who lived there previously called the police after being dragged out of bed and physically strangled by some strange force or entity. Now, we've also had stories of people being asked to go and value the property and coming out running. One lady from a local estate agent said that when she was in there, she was walking up a long flight of stairs and someone or something put their hand up her skirt. She turned around to slap whoever it was, only to see there was no one there. However, whilst she looked down, the front door slammed of its own accord. The owner of the property, Andy Yates, said, "I lived in the house by myself, came downstairs to find steak knives balanced on the plates in the drying rack. I've tried to rent the house out, but it's only been for about 4 days because people will not stay there. They get too frightened and they're forced out." He decided he was going to go in and measure it up for some new furniture, get the whole place decorated. He brought the decorators in. Within 3 hours, they were out too. And he also said that he'd seen a child's shadow move out of the fireplace, hover above his head for almost 1/4 of an hour, and then as soon as he started to move towards it, it disappeared back into the wall. Now also, there's a cupboard under the stairs which is pretty notorious too, with lots of mediums say they believe that children had been locked up in there. This is the sound captured by Hull University students when they placed a microphone in that cupboard under the stairs. Now, mediums report that there is an evil sensation, a force of evil that lurks inside this. And people walking by often see small phantom faces at the windows. And he says, when I put the house up for rent, a woman who'd lived there for 24 years previously contacted on Facebook. She told him that she'd been dragged out of bed and strangled. And when the police turned up, they told her off, claiming it was just a hoax. And then, just as they were about to leave, a bookcase fell on the two police officers and they ran straight out of the house. Jolene Lockwood is a clairvoyant medium. She described the house as horrific, and she sensed the presence of an evil entity, an adult, and a child. She said, as soon as I walked into the house, I felt this horrific energy. I noticed a woman on the stairs who I believe had been drugged. Now, along with her business partner, she says she discovered a sinister force in the back bedroom and heard the growling of an aggressive man.
I lived here for 8 years, up till 2007, during which time there was loads of activity happening in my house. Before I moved here, I was a complete non-believer in anything ghost-like. But while I lived here, more and more stuff happened which I just had no explanation for. People asked me to rent it out for people to come in. I didn't really think that people would want to pay to come into a haunted house, but it's been empty since 2007 and a few people have suggested it lately, so I opened it and we've just been inundated with people, and apparently loads of people have said it's one of the most active properties I've been in. We've had mediums from all different places in the country all coming up with exactly the same story about young children being not treated very well here and abused and all sorts of stuff. Basically more and more stuff happening. It just keeps happening all the time, and it's a real eye-opener for me not being involved in anything like this before. I've just started doing this 2 months ago, and the stuff that's happened in the last 2 months has been amazing. People getting strangled, thrown on the floor, thrown against windows, and all sorts of stuff. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes.
But perhaps the most incredible bit of footage that we found anywhere came from my visit. But when I was there, I walked around with a small recording device that we call a Marantz. And I just simply walked into a lot of the rooms, didn't particularly speak to talk about it, decided I was simply going to leave the Marantz in a room for 5 or 6 minutes. You can hear me walking down the stairs as I leave a Marantz in the room when you hear this, sort of an old man's laughing, wheezing. There's a man spirit in this house, and that of a child or children. Now, looking back into the history of the property, we discovered that back in the day, this property was a much bigger property on this same site. Parts of the original building remain, like the staircase and the first floor balcony. A lot of the other house had been rebuilt many, many years ago. But it had been used as a children's home, and it was said that the man running it used to beat and abuse the children, and that is why it was closed as Hull's dirty secret. Could it be those troubled spirits that leave sounds like this? When you first hear them, you always make an excuse. It's a neighbour moving around, it's a pigeon in the loft, maybe something off TV. But deep down you know, you get that feeling. And on the outskirts of Sunderland, in a quiet street, on the quietest of estates, Susan McFarlane had taken over the 2-bedroom house from a boyfriend who dumped her for a younger model. She'd endured the toughest time getting him to sign over the mortgage to her. She could barely afford it, but she decided to give up all of her perks, all of her indulgences, so she could have her own place, all to herself. Well, perhaps we all have to share what we have, if not with another person, with something on the other side of the Great Divide. Susan worked hard. Surely she deserved a little time on her own. 11 years earlier, that very same house had had a young family in turmoil. Arguments, domestic violence, broken hopes, shattered bones. Visits from the police soon followed by the inevitable council visits, and children dragged away from their unpleasant, foul-mouthed parents. Yet this only happened after their youngest child, Karen, was killed after falling down the stairs. The neighbours knew how badly the little girl had been treated. She'd suffered massive bruising, 3 or 4 arm breaks or fractures, yet still her death was declared an accident. Not that Susan, the new tenant, should have known anything about another family's dirty laundry. However, she did read about the death of a man on TV, decapitated in a road accident outside of Birmingham. She thought it was terrible, and yet never realised that this man was the abusive man who may have murdered his own child in the house where she was living. The tragedies kept on going. The 2 children, aged 12 and 13, a brother and a sister, had eventually been adopted by the same family in Durham. They both died in a car crash along with their new stepmother. Their real mother, now living alone and suffering depression, decided to end it all and kept taking tablets until now she was gone too. Yet rather than being the end, this was merely the beginning of a violent chapter of viciousness from beyond the grave. Like so many of these things, it starts slow, few things being moved from where Susan had put them. Followed by the odd knock, a creak or a bang. Susan was in complete denial. After all, she'd lived there for almost 8 months without any trouble. But maybe it was the violent manner of his death. Perhaps his black, headless soul had nowhere else to go. So he returned to where he'd really enjoyed beating up his young family and raping his daughters. She'd been watching a horror movie on TV when she heard a heavy thump. It was so loud she thought it had been someone kicking her front door in. She raced around the house checking everything, and yet nothing had been moved. And just as she settled back into bed to watch the awful shows that are on late in the night of the weekend, something moved the bed. Not enough to lift it, but enough for her to know that there was something in her bedroom. She switched on the main light and she could see nothing, but all of her senses were on fire, her ears straining out to catch any sound that was not coming from herself or from that television. Just then the door opened to the bedroom and closed with a crash so violent that a lamp on the bedside table fell onto the bed. Susan was beginning to panic. She grabbed her phone. She ran down into the kitchen where she tried to rationalize what had just happened. She almost called her mother, her best friend, even the police. But as her heartbeat slowed, she laughed. Imagine getting spooked by a cheesy horror movie. And at that moment, there was a knocking in her porch. Something was banging against the glass. She put the light on and she walked along towards her own front door. She could see the door was closed. She could see through the glass there seemed to be something moving in there. And just as she opened that door, a huge crow started flapping at her. She let the crow out of the door eventually, but day by day things began to get worse and worse. Little by little, nothing major. But the acceleration had begun, and one day when her sister and her 12-year-old daughter visited, something awful happened. The young girl was running around, and whilst in Susan's bedroom, she saw the figure of a man. And as she tried to run, it grabbed her and swung her hard into an old wooden bookcase. The youngster burst her lip and nose and began screaming. Susan's sister Caroline didn't believe a word, yet the child was adamant and could even describe this crazy-eyed man with longish hair and a gap between his front teeth. 20 minutes later, the entire family's at Sunderland Royal Hospital. The child is treated not only for cuts and bruises, but also for shock. Susan kept quiet about her fears, but deep down she knew that whatever had suddenly moved into her home was beginning to flex its muscles. It was the neighbour whose son was a policeman who began to realise just what was going on. He'd told his parents that Jeff, the vicious ex-neighbour, had thrown the daughter he'd been molesting downstairs to her death. They just couldn't prove it. He also told them that following his much-deserved death, that it wouldn't surprise him if he haunted the poor girl next door. They even gave Susan a picture of Jeff to show the little girl, already knowing that it was almost certainly him. On receiving that picture, Susan knew that the figure that she had seen had been the same man. But what was next? She'd tried so very hard to keep on with her life. This entity hadn't hurt her. But from that very night, the war was about to begin. Rustling in cupboards and wardrobes. Whispering from every room that she was not in. Footsteps on the stairs and walking heavy-footed along the hall. And then the commonest form of intimidation, standing at the side of her bed, staring down at her whilst she slept. If ever she woke in the night or needed the toilet, she knew that she would see him and would need to respond, yet this thing loved fear and seemed to feed on it. One night, with her eyes tightly shut, Susan tried to get to the toilet in the hall. She felt two heavy arms around her, tightening and tightening, squeezing the air from her gasping lungs. In the pitch blackness, she tried to scream, and as soon as she started, she felt herself thrown to the ground. Both knees cracked against the wood floor. She almost passed out with the pain. Finally, on regaining full consciousness, she had the realization that she was becoming petrified to be within her own home. She tentatively opened her eyes, and he was there. One evening she was in the bath and she heard grunting. The mirror was all steamed up, yet there was something moving behind the steam. She stood up and leaned over, wiping it clear with a sponge, and could see Jeff staring back at her. She screamed and fell backwards into the water, slamming her head off the back of the bath. She needed 8 stitches to seal that wound, as the neighbours again took her to A&E and brought her back in the early hours of the morning. On opening her front door, the house was alive with noise. All of her TV sets were on, all 3 loud on different channels. The radio was pounding, and at the same old songs, the washing machine spinning despite being empty. The neighbours, who'd made sure that all the lights were off before leaving the house, were amazed to see that all of the lights were back on. Susan went back in and screamed, "Stop it! Stop it!" And of course, nothing happened. Except the neighbour's wife had a tuft of her hair pulled out of her head. She ran out of the house, her scalp bleeding. Her husband asked if Susan was okay, and then headed off at speed to catch up with his wife. That night, as she slept, Susan felt someone getting into bed with her. And as she froze with fear, she felt hands on her shoulders. She could feel him pushing his body against her, and out of bed she leapt, grabbing a heavy ornament, and battered the empty bed with it. No more sleep that night. Instead, the following day, she sought out her local spiritualist church. 4 kindly ladies all came out to bless the house, hopefully removing this violent entity. And after a lengthy session, the house seemed calm at last. 4 months of absolute peace and quiet, and yet there was still one final surprise in store. Susan's mother visited and heard her daughter so happy for the first time in so long. She invited her to travel out to Kendal in the Lake District where her mum and dad had a holiday home. It's exactly what she needed. A break from all this stress and all of the terror that she'd been through. So in the first week of August, she filled the car full of petrol. She left her street for the first time proper. Within the hour, she was dead. And there would be an eyewitness. Derek was a taxi driver, and his car had just stopped at traffic lights near Hendon, where he clearly saw a small red car travelling at speed towards the junction. His red light turned to green, but he stayed put as it was obvious this car would not be able to stop. Derek wrote in his insurance report, "I could see the red vehicle approaching at almost 60 miles an hour in a 30 zone. The woman driving was trying to hit the man sitting next to her, who seemed to be trying to pull the wheel away from her. Just as the car crossed the junction, a wagon, also doing more than 30 miles an hour, hit it side on, rammed it off the road against the corner edge of a building, almost cutting the car in half. I ran to see if either of the occupants were still alive. To my surprise, there was only a young woman in the car. She was bleeding from the chest. She said to me, 'He killed me. He's killed me.' I phoned 999 and gave this exact statement to the police. The lorry driver, Alfred Turnbull from Sunderland, said, 'I saw the car crash too. There were two people in the car fighting.' The police report said that they were looking for a man in his 30s who had left the scene of a major RTA, a road traffic accident. He had wild, crazy eyes, longish hair, and a gap between his front teeth. Susan's neighbours and her mum knew the truth. And somewhere in Sunderland, this entity is almost certainly making someone else's life a misery. There's somebody else wanting to buy a property with murder, rape, incest, assaults of all kinds. Someone will walk into that house just wanting to check it out, thinking, well, maybe I could buy this property. Perhaps it's perfect for me. Little would they know what lay in store. Now, little Bellingham lies in the middle of the North's finest countryside, and yet it has a grave there that is ominously cursed. An 18th century hellraiser, gambler and womanizer called Bowery Charlton spent much of his life in that area. His real name, William Charlton of the Bower, Reedsdale, at a time when the Charltons were one of the North's most powerful families. Yet the Jacobite rebellion would change much of that. The Crown dictated that no Catholic family could keep horses in case they joined the war alongside Bonnie Prince Charlie against the English Crown. So when a neighbour called Leadbitter, a fellow Catholic, heard that the government was sending a troop of soldiers to confiscate his horses and his black stallion that was worth a lot of money, Charlton decided to save the day. He hid the horse in the woods, but its neighing made the soldiers aware there was a horse out there. So at night, using hoists, Charlton lifted the horse up to the first floor of the stables, hid it behind hay bales. Problem was, the horse was thirsty, and there was no way for it to get any water without removing all the bales. So it began stamping and kicking out. So Charlton got onto its back, leapt down and rode like hell for the River Tyne. The river at that time was very dangerous and in full flood, and that stopped any of the king's men from following. On getting to his fortified home, he hid the animal again and waited for a knock that never came. Eventually, Charlton did involve himself in the Jacobite rebellion and fought gallantly at the defeat of the Scots at Preston. Charlton, knowing his cause was lost, he returned to his home near Bellingham. But when Bonnie Prince Charlie threatened another war, the Crown arrested all of those loyal to him. And once in prison, Charlton, now in his late 50s, soon died due to ill treatment, poor diet. Death had been inevitable. He left 2 illegitimate daughters to 2 of his numerous lovers. They lived in Hexham, and whenever the church offered prayers for the royal family, the 2 daughters would walk out of the church in disgust. Bowery would have been proud of them. Now he's currently buried in Bellingham churchyard. And because he was betrayed by a local who pointed troops to his house, he cursed those who were jealous of his wealth. And it said if you put both hands on his grave and close your eyes tight, his spirit charges through you and shows you visions of the torture that he witnessed before he died. Malcolm Young, a historian from London, wrote, I'd heard of the so-called curse, and on seeing this grave in such an inauspicious cemetery, I had my reservations. Yet on clenching that mossy grave, I closed my eyes and saw bright flashes of people having their eyes burnt out with red-hot pokers. A man had one thrust into his fundament. Others were being cut and slashed, whilst other prisoners stayed terrified in cells, awaiting their turn. My stomach turned over as I felt their anxiety and their fear, and I felt myself having to tug my own hands away before I screamed out. It was truly one of the most disturbing things that I've ever done. In 2008, Scott Alec McGowan from Dundee visited Bellingham to see a relative, and he stopped off to see Bowery Charlton's grave, a Scottish hero figure. Well, not knowing the legend, he put both of his hands on the grave and suddenly found himself witnessing torture and murder. A woman having her ears and breasts cut off, the wounds cauterized with a red-hot poker. He said, I could smell the burning flesh. I heard the girl screaming until she passed out and just hung there on the manacles. It was a bright day, yet my mind was full of the dark dungeon where all kinds of horrible things were happening all around me. A man was roped down to a table and they were hammering nails into him. With each blow, everyone was being spattered by his blood, and at that moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder and yelled out. It was my cousin, and I pulled my hands away. This was like a direct link to another time. Charlton seems to watch over his grave and doesn't bear fools gladly. Now, if ever there was a ghost story that could be confirmed and be current, it's the situation in Killingworth. On April Fool's Day, an ordinary house. It looked like all of the others on the estate, and yet it experienced something horrible. There'd never been any ghostly activity there. The family had lived there for about 15 years without any sort of problem. Then they decided to change their house around, knocking down 2 small rooms together, making the resulting room their bedroom. Well, the work was done by friends and family, so it took rather longer than they'd planned. But they were finally in the latter stages. All that was needed was a bit of paint and the putting up of curtain rails. The residents do not wish to be identified, so we call them John and Mary. They have 2 children. The first sign that there was something different about the house was when Mary returned home to find the microwave on, the oven too, and the toaster, although there was nothing in it. She switched everything off and wondered if either of her children had done it. She picked them up from her mum's and asked them, and the little girl said, "No, it wasn't us. It was the man." On trying to find out who this man was, the answers her own children gave her did nothing to calm her nerves. "Oh, he comes to see me in my room every night," she said. Then the boy chipped in, "I've seen him on the stairs, just watching us. He says he's not very happy at what you've done." Mary went to the library the next day to ask what was on the land in Killingworth before the housing estate was built. It made her feel sick when they read old newspaper columns talking about the removal of old graves on the site of an old church. And on getting back home, her husband sat on the settee and asked her to sit down. He said, "I've just seen a ghost." His face was as white as a sheet, and as a tradesman he wasn't prone to making things up. For him to say this, it was obvious he'd seen something. He held her hand and said, "I was watching TV when I felt that there was something or someone watching me, and I turned my head just slightly, and on the other side of the glass door into the living room, there was a tall man staring in. I turned my head right round. I could clearly see him with these huge eyes staring in. At first I thought it was a burglar, and as I sat up, he came through the doors without opening them and just vanished. I wanted to run, and then I remembered the kids were upstairs, so I ran up there to grab them, and they said, 'Daddy, don't be silly. He's here all the time.'" John said, "We are moving house." Mary then told him what she'd found out, and they started making inquiries. And on one night, 2 days later, rang Nightowls' main switchboard. They got a vicar out, and the blessing was not effective. And I was told that this was the case by the church itself. So I asked some people from a spiritualist church to go in. 2 did, and said that they experienced a man who loved the children, but were very angry that they were not his. Elizabeth, a spiritualist for 43 years, said his children had died very young, and now he'd chosen to make these 2 living children his. She said this is nothing straightforward. This is potentially dangerous. They had tried to move the spirit on, but they said that there was something to do with the house holding him there. Every day, something else would happen. One night as Mary kissed her daughter goodnight, something hit her hard in the kidneys, knocking the breath out of her. She tried not to let it show, or it would have upset the child. As she left the room, leaving it open in case she cried in the night, she looked back along the passage to the child asleep in bed when something closed the door. Despite her own blind terror, she went to the door and it wouldn't open. She ran down for John, who raced upstairs and put his shoulder to it, slamming it open. And there was the little girl sitting up. "Where's he gone, Mummy? Don't chase him away, he's really nice." Just at that moment, they heard a scream from the boys' room and both ran to the sound. The bed had been pulled from the wall and the lad was bouncing up and down. Then they looked towards the window, and there was the full figure of a man. The curtains blew in, and he was gone. They hugged the children, and for the next 3 months, all slept together. 3 times spiritualists paid them a visit, including 2 that I recommended from Yorkshire. Things calmed down for a week or so, but it was so obvious that that little, ordinary, modern house in Killingworth still had major problems. I visited the place, once with the family there and once without. When they were not there, it felt benign, gentle, a reasonably pleasant home. Yet when the family were there, the atmosphere was charged and heavy, and I felt headache and nausea, and the children became hyper. They were throwing out major energy, and it attracted a darker sort. On going upstairs with Mary, the rug rolled itself up outside the daughter's door. No sort of wind could have made that happen. Then on talking to the children, I was told that he throws us up in the air and catches us. We feel him touching us as we go to sleep. And if that was not alarming enough, the girl then said, I don't know how he can see us when he has no eyes. The dad confirmed just 2 empty black sockets that seemed to stare right through you. I headed off and made some calls, and it was almost as if this thing knew that something was coming. Neighbours began to see this eyeless face at the window when the family were out. They would hear cries and moans from the empty house. They could hear furniture being moved and banged against the wall. This caused them to call the family, who knew only too well what was going on. Then 6 days ago, they returned to the house, and there in their living room was the worst stench imaginable. And in the kitchen, the chip pan was on fire. The ring had been switched on and the kitchen was black with smoke. John drowned the fire out with a damp towel and proceeded to clean things up. On putting the children to bed with them, they heard the son's bed move next door, and on checking the room, it was upside down on the floor. Once in there, the door slammed behind him. It took him 10 minutes to get out. In the daughter's room, the bed was covered in toys that had been in boxes and on shelves in her toy cupboard. Then finally, as they all walked upstairs at the end of the night, there, at the top of the stairs, stood the dark figure staring down at them with eyeless sockets. Dad said, walk up, ignore it, into our bedroom. Mary was less sure, and at that, there was this angry roar. And they all raced down into the living room. The following day, an exorcist arrived and worked his way through the entire house and garden. During the ceremony, there was a huge crash, as if someone had hurled a wardrobe across the room. Yet nothing had been moved anywhere. 5.5 hours later, a knock at Mum's door. The job was done. As the family returned to the house, they could all feel that the dark, oppressive atmosphere had gone. It really did feel like a new house. Since then, barely a week later, all is well. Yet such is the demand for land to build houses on. Graveyards and cemeteries are being resituated all the time. The North has been such an incredible area for historical battling. I would be surprised if there wasn't anywhere where someone hasn't died. Then, all you need is a trigger. The massive energy of children at play. The change in the living energy of a home due to DIY. Add to that the removal of the dead. And who knows what could happen? How many other homes on that estate have had visitors watching their children as they sleep, wanting them for themselves? For centuries, the graveyard at Tynemouth Priory has been haunted. And to this day, people park in a seafront car park on an evening, scouring it on the hill opposite for the phantoms that have been clearly seen. In 1978, a number of photographs were taken showing long white figures ambling between the headstones. But if you look at the wall of Tynemouth's Holy Saviour's Church, you'll see the carved initials MM and a heart. These types of markings can be seen around the world as a symbol of young love, but these particular ones deserve to be looked for, as they're the basis of a supposed curse. MM was Mary Marshall, better known as Polly to her friends. She lived with her dad, Robert, in a simple house on Cross Street in Tynemouth. And in 1894, the South Staffordshire Regiment was sent up north to be stationed at Tynemouth Barracks. They were getting ready for military action abroad and needed to be brought up to standard. One of these soldiers was a private called Sam Emery, aged only 20, who spotted young Polly and fell very much in love. Anybody living in the northeast knows of a walk called the Broadway or the Boulevard. It's a beautiful walk from Whitley Bay to Tynemouth, or vice versa. And this walk leads directly to Holy Saviour's Church. And during the 18 and 1900s, this was the site for an awful lot of billing and cooing. The churchyard found many lovers flirting, kissing, and late at night, sex between the tombstones was not unknown. But the most important thing, though, was to mark your union into the wall surrounding the churchyard. One Tynemouth clergyman wrote in 1826, "Once you have proclaimed your love by carving the wall of Holy Saviour's Church, to betray that commitment would curse you to hell, and the demons shall pursue you and your family for all time." Well, Polly and Sam carved their love into that wall. It's faded now, but you can still clearly see it. It was the first time Polly had been in love, first time she'd made love. And the commitment that she had promised really meant something to her. However, just when the romance was going so well, Sam's regiment was transferred to Strenshaw, near York. Nowadays, with modern transport, it's a workable distance. Yet back then, it might as well have been Australia. Emery was still in love, so continued communicating by letter. But after a few months, he began to feel that her demeanour towards him was changing. Then out of the blue, she received a letter telling her to watch her back, as he may just arrive in Tynemouth when she least expected it. He'd heard a rumour from another soldier who had family in Cullercoats nearby that Polly had another suitor that she seems to have really taken to. This wasn't true. Polly answered that she would be happy to see him whenever he could get up there. However, the 100 miles between them began to drive Emery crazy. He was wallowing in an insane jealousy, and the more he thought about it, the more manic he became. Finally, in July 1894, Emery deserted and headed up to the north. He met with Polly and spent an afternoon with her, burning his uniform in the garden, and he was now firmly back in civilian clothes again. What his girlfriend didn't know was that he'd visited a local ironmonger and he'd bought a large clasp knife and had asked the owner, Thomas Moore of Tynemouth, to sharpen it. His crazed jealousy was about to explode in the most vicious of ways. They were seen walking the Broadway arm in arm, laughing and joking, until they neared the churchyard of Holy Saviour's, when Emery noticed a slight bruise on her neck, and an argument began. The vicar, Reverend Charles Nichols, was on his bike returning from a visit, and he saw what he thought was a couple of ruffians play fighting in the churchyard. Yet on getting closer, he saw that a larger man was assaulting someone that they had pulled down to the ground. The vicar screamed out for others to help on a busy late afternoon. He threw his bait to the ground and ran towards the victim. As the man ran off, Polly had struggled to her feet. She was covered in blood. Her neck had a huge gaping wound that spurted each time the heart beat. She couldn't speak. She merely gurgled, and wide-eyed she staggered towards the Reverend, her hands badly cut from trying to defend herself as she fell into the clergyman's arms. He dragged her into the church and lay her down on the couch, where she bled to death in a matter of minutes. Two men chased Emery, who on a couple of occasions turned to threaten them with a bloody knife. Thomas Warren said he looked like a crazed animal, staring at us like he wanted us dead too. The other man, James Gibson, said, I chased him until he reached the sidings near Tynemouth Station, and then he gave me the slip. Later that night, when Polly's murder was on everyone's lips, Emery just ambled into their local bar, the Crescent, and asked for some paper. He jotted something down, then slid it into an envelope. He downed a glass of stout and then asked the landlady to only read it once he was long gone. This was the only confession he would ever pen. He was walking towards Tynemouth's prison, known at the time as their House of Correction, when two police officers pushed him to the ground, removing a super-sharpened clasp knife covered with blood from his belt. Pretty soon he was up in court to face his crime, and the confession guaranteed the result, and he was found guilty of murdering Mary Marshall, his beloved Polly. What was most ironic was that Polly had remained completely loyal to her man, and Emery, riddled with guilt, began writing to her father begging for his forgiveness. Robert Marshall, her broken father, replied to him, "You carved your promise to my girl in holy saviors, and you broke it. You took her life, and you have destroyed mine. The curse will drive you to hell, where you deserve." On the 11th of November 1894, Samuel Emery was led by his executioner, James Billington, to the gallows. Billington said he was ready to die. He seemed calm and unafraid. His only hope was to be reunited with a lass he'd dispatched, though I doubt that she would wish that, as she enjoys the glorious Almighty. The Holy Saviour's Church was home to a glowing white figure for almost 3 months following his hanging. The locals believed it to be Polly, still in shock at what the man she truly loved had done to her. In 1972, research was carried out to find out whether the Holy Saviour's curse had affected anyone else. Over 30 locals came forward to say that they were no longer with partners, despite carving their names into the wall. They had entire catalogues of misery that they'd experienced, including stillbirth, cot death, cancer, leukemia, early death, divorce, and no end of horrific accidents. One had fallen from the cliff to his death, another decapitated during a motoring accident. To betray someone who loves you is said to incite karma to work against you. This is nature's curse upon you. In 1962, Ernie Thompson cheated on his wife in Bedlington with a woman called Sue Stevens from Whitley Bay. During the affair, he suffered an accident with a bandsaw that snapped, slicing into his lisc, where his torso meets his leg, severing an artery, and he bled to death. Michael O'Donnell discovered his wife was cheating with one of his best friends. Before he could confront them, they were both killed in a motorway crash head-on the outskirts of Gateshead. A professional medium, Arthur Conway, stood up at a meeting near Archbold Terrace in Newcastle and said the dead will curse those who betray true love. Those who no longer enjoy the magic of life's energy long to feel that again and will do anything to help them feel. They prey on those who betray the true love of a partner. They seek them out and watch from the shadows so that they can make their lives wretched and miserable. There's numerous cases where this seems to have been proven true. Whilst his wife was working at the cigarette factory WD&H Wills on the Coast Road, Newcastle, back in the early 50s, Brian Simpson was meeting a woman in Jesmond nearby, and one afternoon they were having sex when suddenly the sheet was ripped from their bed. And there, standing above them, was a huge female figure who screamed so loudly that the neighbours called the police. As he grabbed his clothes, Simpson stepped out of bed, stood on one of his boots, turning his ankle and sending him crashing through the front window. His throat was cut, and he bled to death in moments. During another illicit meeting at the Swallow Hotel in Gateshead in 1972, married Vivian Craig was in bed with married Dennis Purdy when something happened that made the local press. A photographer was working on a wedding in the functions room when he spotted a huge, dark, moving shape and photographed it. It disappeared and he thought nothing of it, continuing his wedding pics. Yet later that day, an ambulance was called as a wardrobe had been thrown on top of the two lovers, breaking both of his legs and smashing into the woman's face, breaking her nose and snapping 8 teeth off at the root. As the police had to be called, the affair was found out and both parties divorced. And afterwards, Vivian said, "The door opened and this huge black figure seemed to float in. We both just turned and stared as we could clearly see it. And just then, this huge wardrobe, far too heavy for any one man to move, flew 8 feet through the air, hitting and hurting us both badly. This thing threw it like it was a child's toy. It was a ghost. I've no idea why." And in the Seaburn Hotel further south, Joanne Clark was meeting James Burton during the 7th month of their affair. They decided to go down under the sands later that August night to have sex, and as they began undressing themselves, hidden from prying eyes, suddenly there was a woman standing between them. She had wide, staring eyes, and with one flick of her arm had scratched claws into his flesh, dragging it down to his penis, scratching the flesh off that too. The woman screamed and, despite only being partially dressed, ran off the sand straight in front of a van. She was hit, broke a collarbone and 8 ribs. A spiritualist from South Shields in 1985 said at the Open Circle, "Cheating is the root of many hauntings. If you're there, even with your wife or girlfriend, spirits can feel the negative energy and seek to destroy it. They often choose to inhabit their house where this hypocrisy goes on, often making their presence known until the affair is ended." Footsteps across ceilings or attic floors, dark shapes in bedrooms while you try to sleep, and the sudden shock, all trying to let the cheat know that they're being watched from the other side. Kath Graham from Newcastle had been cheating, and one day she walked into her house late at night, didn't bother turning on a light. Her dog suddenly started barking as if there was someone there. Just as she opened the door into her darkened bedroom, she was hit as if by a kick in the stomach, and there was a huge sound of air blowing all around her. Yet the worst was when a young girl called Julie Haynes committed suicide after finding her fiancé Paul Fairley had been cheating on her. Fairley even took his new girlfriend Helen Monk to her funeral. Then on moving back into her home, the home he'd shared with Julie, everything began to happen. One night, Helen woke up the entire street screaming because someone with long fingernails was trying to kill her. Her neck had huge black bruises where she was being strangled, and the following night, a small, fast-moving black shadow threw an iron at Paul as he sat watching television, causing him to require 17 stitches to his brow. Over 40 incidents in a matter of months, and they both were petrified as to where it was leading. And then one night, there were a few bangs and bumps from the house, and Helen said, "Let's get married." From the second she said that, the house began to stink. The pressure in the home gave them both severe headaches as they tried to shake it off. It arrived. It was obvious there was something in the room. Paul turned around screaming until he turned around to see his ex hanging from a noose in front of him. And yet she was staring right at him and said, "Hello, Paul," in a half-choked voice. He moved towards her only to be knocked to his feet. Helen saw the image too and left him there and then, never to return. And if you betray someone, It may well be that your karma turns on you. Those who have felt that pain from the other side may decide to teach you a lesson.